And we're going to start this episode once again with a positional assessment. We've been doing this segment over the past handful of weeks, looking at each Bengals positional unit as they head into the offseason, how they fared in 2016, potential internal free agents that they are facing to lose this offseason, as well as the state of the group in 2017 and what adjustments, if any, need to be made. Now, this one should be a very interesting group to talk about this week, because not only are there two major free agents and the guys who have been their two best offensive linemen really over the past handful of years, there's also two big question marks in terms of young players that have not fared well so far with the Bengals, and there's one other scapegoat right in the middle of the offensive line that a lot of people just seem to pile on, right or wrong, in Russell Bodine. So, Scott, why don't you talk about this group? Obviously, 2016 was not a good year for this group. They let up a huge amount of sacks. Andy Dalton was pressured often, and it was really a major one of the major causes, I would say, one of the two or three major causes for the Bengals getting to 6-9-1. So how did maybe positives and negatives from last year, and how you see this group shaping up in 2017 because of Kevin Seiler looking at free agency, Andrew Whitworth doing the same, and obviously, Cedric Ogbuehi and Jake Fisher kind of still waiting to yield some good results there too.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting you mentioned positive, because as you said, there were very few. It was nice to see that Whitworth, there was some speculation over the last year or two, okay, he's kind of gone downhill. How much does he have left? He still had a very good year. So it was nice to see that he still contributed very well. It was nice to see over on the right side, Zeitler did pretty well. It was nice to see that Bodine did not look like the league's worst center last year. So I'd say those are probably the positives. The negatives, of course, as you mentioned, there's probably too many to cover in one podcast or in a segment of a podcast. But just briefly, Cedric Ogbuehi obviously didn't pan out. A lot of people were ready to move on from Andre Smith. They let him walk. He went to the Vikings. The assumption was, okay, Ogbuehi steps right in. We don't, miss anything. If anything, we get better. That obviously didn't happen. He ended up getting benched for Eric Winston. Jake Fisher came in. He didn't do a whole lot better. We found out at the end of the year Clint Bowling had been playing hurt all year. He ended up not playing that well. So I'll just pretty much just summarize where, the state of the line, where it's at right now, and then I'll let you guys kind of take it from there as far as what they should do going forward or what fixes we would have. One very scary thing is if you look at who is actually signed right now as of February 8th in 2017. So, a month or so before free agency, a couple months before the draft, who do they have actually signed? And as you mentioned, Zeitler and Whitworth are both gone. Winston's also gone. So what you have right now, at tackle, you have Ogbuehi and Fisher, who obviously had a lot of struggles. Last year was their second year. They didn't really seem to show a whole lot of improvement from the first year. Obviously, Ogbuehi was hurt the first year. At center, you have Russell Bodine. And as much as the fans want to move on from him, TJ Johnson's a free agent. Bodine's really all you have. And the team has shown no willingness to move one of the guards to center. They pretty much, if you aren't drafted as a center, they seem content to leave the guards at guard. And then at guard, you have Clint Bowling, who obviously did not play as well last year. He was hurt. Trey Hopkins, who I'm a fan of. Whenever I see him in preseason, I think he looks great, but they just don't seem to give him much of a chance. And then Christian Westerman, who didn't play because he was a rookie, and then Alex Redmond, who's kind of one of those practice squad guys they kind of bring in. And that's basically it. And there's not a whole lot of actual starting depth other than Bodine and Bowling are the only two guys who have played on that line for more than a season. And that's only 7 total, and you're playing 5 of them, at least 5 every single play, and maybe more in like a jumbo package or something. And by comparison, I think we have 6 defensive tackles under contract. We usually only play like 2 of them. So they obviously have to add some more offensive linemen, either free agency, through the draft, re-signing some of their own. But just the way the roster looks right now, it's just a very scary situation. Because if you say this is your team and you're starting next year with, Fisher and Oboye, your tackles, Bowling and let's say Westerman, and then Bodine as your 5 starters, I think last year's offensive line unit would look great by comparison, which is not a very good thing.
Right. And as I mentioned, they had so many struggles protecting the passer all season. And it was, much of it was Oboye. Some of it was Bodine in the middle. But the other guys weren't immune from issues either. So, when you mention certain contract statuses of players and, obviously who they currently have under contract and who is slated to start, if you use the hypothetical that these free agents are going to move, it is a bit scary. Connor, you had wrote a piece for Cincy Jungle about the team re-signing Andre Smith, and I'd like you to touch on that, as well as your thought, specifically the guy that one guy that is interesting and frustrating at the same time is Jake Fisher, because he did okay at times at right tackle last year when he was spelling Oboye after he struggled, but they don't really seem to have a true idea as to where he's going to fit. Is he a guard? Is he a tackle? Late in 2015, they had him line up at H-back when Ryan Hewitt was injured. So I'm really interested about those two players and your perspective on them.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, the perspective of Bengals fans. Not that anyone's right or wrong, but fans so often are like, oh, I want the Bengals to play the young guys. And then they catch themselves in a situation like this, and they're like, well, now what do we do? We're like panicking as if, like in the offseason, if you have inexperienced young players starting out at a position in the regular season, people don't like it. But then when you get midway through the season and you're like, okay, Michael Johnson is a pretty decent run stopper, but isn't going to really offer that much as a pass rusher, then people get to the point where they're like, okay, well now, we don't need Michael Johnson. Let's put in Will Clark, or let's sign, Chris Carter because he got a sack in a preseason 2 years ago. So from that standpoint, it's just an interesting dichotomy, because I think the Bengals have, from my personal opinion, it's neither right nor wrong. It's just an opinion, but I appreciate the way the Bengals are very, very focused on grooming their own. And I know a lot of Bengals fans will disagree with me on that point, but they usually don't catch themselves in situations like this where they don't have, if they lose Zeitler, then, what happens? And today I was writing for SBNation.com I was writing basically the post on who are the guys who can get franchise tagged. And I was thinking about the Bengals, and there's really 3 guys who, in theory, could get franchised in Kirkpatrick, Zeitler, and Whitworth, and those are all legitimate possibilities. The Bengals last year paid Kirkpatrick, I think, $7 or $9 million, and the franchise for corners is only $4 or $5 million more than that for 1 year. And granted, that's a lot of money, but to keep a guy $4 or $5 million more when you have all that cap space when you're the Bengals isn't the end of the world. And you could say the same thing with Zeitler, say the same thing with Whitworth. I would think Whitworth would be the last of those guys to get tagged because of the fact that he's old, and he's probably the easiest guy to re-sign out of those 3.
Right.
But it's an interesting thing to bring up. And in terms of Oboye and Fisher, I, like most fans, probably wouldn't feel comfortable, with both of those guys starting. You hope that one of them at least is starting, I would guess. Unless the team finds a guy in free agency. And another topic I'll kind of get into, but not really, is the fact that I think now that the Super Bowl is over, most people are going to start talking about this is one of the worst free agent classes we've seen in a very, very long time. You look back to the 2012 draft, the first round of the 2012 draft are the guys who, if they have their 5th-year option, then they'll be hitting the free agency market for the first time this year. And then rounds 2 through 7, as well as the guys who didn't get that option in 2013, are the guys hitting the market. And you look at the guys, and again, it's not a knock to Zeitler, but Zeitler is by no means a superstar, and he's probably he's going to be the biggest get on the free agency market this year. Where last year you look and you have Cordy Glenn, who's a franchise left tackle. You have I wish I had it in front of me, all these guys, but Zeitler's the number one guy, and if you're looking at the Bengals, he's not even the most talented player on the offensive line. It's Whitworth, and Whitworth isn't the biggest get in free agency because of his age. But it's a pretty weak class. You look at the receivers: Alshon Jeffrey, Terrell Pryor, Deshaun Jackson, Michael Floyd are the top four. I would say Marvin Jones is better than at least three of those guys, or at least was last year. I'd say probably Travis Benjamin last year was better than three of those guys right now. So it's a really weak class. I think there's going to be a lot of think pieces coming out in the near future about that because there just aren't that many big names. And so, it's as fans, we always want the team to spend money and to make these signings. This offseason, I really wouldn't hate the Bengals being pretty conservative, especially considering all the draft capital they have. I think they have like 11 picks in the draft. So I guess to get back to your initial point, there's a couple things. Andre Smith, I think, would be an awesome signing. We touched on it last podcast. So I won't go way into it, but he's coming off a year where he didn't play because he was hurt. He played probably a couple games, I guess, but then he suffered a season-ending injury. Knows the system. Maybe he kicks inside the guard if that's what, if Zeitler leaves. He's not a guy who's going to be pulling a ton, but then again, the Bengals really aren't a team that use a lot of pulling guards, so really wouldn't be a killer thing to deal with. And yeah, I guess that's kind of it. You have Obweki and Fisher. In theory, last year, 2 years ago, 2015, when they get drafted, you hope by this point they're ready and they're starting on the bookends, and that's obviously not the situation you're in now, but I'm not like a lot of fans in thinking that Dalton's gonna get actually murdered if you have Obweki and Fisher at the end starting. Grant, I hope Whitworth comes back, and Zeitler too, which Paul Danner Jr. was saying that the chances I think are 30% Zeitler comes back. But yeah, to sum it up, it's definitely not a great situation. You hope both guys come back. Personally, from my own perspective, I think you don't draft high. You trust your guys. That's what you drafted them for. Is you hope they start to make plays as they get older. It took Dre like 3 or 4 years to get really into his rhythm. It took Iloka a couple of years to get into his rhythm. Sean Williams still he's a pretty good strong safety, but I think it was towards the end of the year where he really started to figure it out. So I don't think it's time to panic. I guess that's all I can say.
I agree with you, and I agree because there's still obviously Obweki and Fisher are really entering just their third season, and Obweki actually is only entering his second true season of playing, just because of injuries. He sat out most
full off season in the NFL too. Never had a full off season yet.
Right. So I see that. I don't want to say I'm panicky, but I am worried, as like Scott said, just because of
it is scary.
What I saw with Obweki last year at right tackle, he just was overmatched, and not always by the elite pass rushers. It was by other guys that were just kind of those marginal okay starters. Scott, I'm looking at, and this is undoubtedly where Kevin Zeitler will be looking in terms of his contract. I'm looking in terms of ballpark. I'm looking at David DeCastro, the offensive guard for the Steelers. I'm looking at his recent contract extension that he signed last offseason to stick with Pittsburgh. Now, he has a couple of Pro Bowl nods, I think, to his, at least one, to his name. He did miss considerable time as a rookie, but he's ended up being a very good guard in the NFL. So he has kind of the Pro Bowl attachment to him. Zeitler doesn't. Maybe that gives him a little bit of edge in terms of money over Zeitler. But that being said, the contract is basically 5 years, $50 million, $16 million signing bonus, and $16 million guaranteed, and he'll be a free agent in 2022. The initial cap hits, 2016 was manageable, $5.27 million. 2017 is by far the largest, and it's an $11 million cap hit. That's a biggie. But actually 2020 is a little bit bigger than that. That's close to $12 million. But you get the point. And then you look at the Bengals and their cap space. The projected cap space that they will have in 2017 is $45 million roughly. Now, I think most people will say, yeah, Zeitler is, as a player, is worth about that type of contract. He's been he's not a star, as Connor said, but he's a very good player. if you're the Bengals, do you just say, hey, this is the contract, and he is your biggest priority? I know we've talked about off-season priorities on this show before, but or do you say, we've got too many other holes now, whether it's wide receiver, linebacker, where we need to do things in both free agency and the draft, and that potential $10-11 million cap hit in 2017 could be spread out amongst maybe 2 or 3 different players?
I think even if Zeitler, even if the team determines he's worth the money and they feel they have the money, I would be very surprised to see them sign him. And I think part of the reason for that is they just signed Bowling to a much better 5-year, $26 million deal. And typically the Bengals seem, especially when Marvin Lewis has been there, when they have 2 positions, they seem to have a tendency to sign one or the other and not both, with the idea being, we have 2 receivers, 2 defensive ends, 2 whatever. We're going to get one of them under contract, and then the other one we just fill in with, whoever, either a cheap veteran, young guys we bring up. You look at something like defensive end. They tried to sign Michael Johnson years ago when he was franchised. He said no. They turned around and gave it to Dunlap. They didn't want to give it to both of them. They did a similar thing with safety. They tried to get Reggie Nelson. He said no. Okay, we get George Aloka. I think we have seen the writing on the wall for Jeremy Hill. They re-signed Giovanni Bernard last year. So I think that precludes that Hill probably won't get extended. And I think that applies also to Clint Bowling. He got that contract for a much better deal. I think they were probably thinking, hey, at the time we lock him up long term. He seems to be getting better. Obviously this year he was hurt. That didn't really work out. But, obviously you're hoping he's healthy. He comes back to what he looked like in 2015. So, okay, we have one of the 2 guards. The other one just becomes Trey Hopkins, Christian Westerman, Alex Redmond, someone we draft or something of that sort. So I think just based on their tendency, which seems to be, we're going to sign one, not both, when we have 2 positions. We already got our one. Therefore, the other one's just going to be, a player to be named later. It would be, I'd be very surprised to see them lock up 2 guys long term. And let's say the deal for Zeitler is something similar to that, 3, 4, 5, 6 years at $8 to $10 million or something of that sort. I'd be very surprised to see them, especially when you figure they've historically, up until Zeitler, they've never really even drafted a guard in round 1. They seem to be much more a team that builds from the outside in. They really haven't drafted or put a priority on guards or centers or even defensive tackle. As far as you look at where they're drafted, they tend to be defensive end, and offensive tackle seems to be the big thing for them, receivers, cornerbacks. And we've talked about this before, how they like to, those outside positions mean a lot more to them. And so the fact they've already got one guard, I'd be very surprised to see them grab that second guard as far as a long-term contract. And even if they replace him, I'd be surprised if they used a high pick, first, second, third round. I could see maybe a mid-round pick, and then just someone who comes in and sits on the bench while Hopkins or Westerman or someone fights it out. Although in reality, they'll probably sign a guy for a deal as far as a veteran minimum who will end up being the starter. But
yeah, and you mentioned the Bengals preferring those outside skill players early on, and unfortunately, that's not usually how you build a successful franchise. Usually you build from the inside out in terms of quarterback, offensive line, defensive line, and then you get your skill positions from there. Regardless, there's like I said, there's some big decisions that the team needs to make this offseason. Connor, if the Bengals sign Whitworth and Zeitler walks, how comfortable are you with the idea with the 2 youngsters, Fisher and Abwehi on the outside, whichever side would be better suited for them, as well as putting Whitworth in at one of the guard spots, whether it's right guard or you kick Bowling over to the right side and Whitworth at left guard? Is that an option that you think could help this line out?
If that's the case and Zeitler walks and Whitworth stays, I would guess it's Whitworth at left tackle, Oblehi backing him up. Then you have Bowling, Bodine, Westerman, and You know what? Actually, you could actually be right there. I mean, because the Bengals generally like their guys have experience. Maybe they do kick in Whitworth to left guard, and then you have Obuehi and Fisher at tackle, Bowling, Bodine, and I guess it's Christian Westerman at right guard. Um, yeah, so I mean, or no, well then Clint Bowling would move at right guard. I don't know. I think if Whitworth stays, I think he stays at left tackle just because the Bengals. I mean, just forget everything I just said before that. I think. I don't think they're going to move Bowling to right guard. I just don't see that. They don't really like to seem to move guys around, and to move. The thing is, to move Whitworth to left guard and Bowling to right guard is moving two guys. When if you just put in Westerman, it's only one change, and they really like that continuity. And I think to Scott's point, just really quick, the Bengals, the Bengals' philosophy in terms of drafting and their team building has always been outside in, and Scott really touched on that with like. I'm not a big Bengals history guy, but everyone talks about how Max Montoya was like their last good guard, and he ended up leaving. Paul Dehner Jr. was talking about the other day how he thinks that Zeitler's just gone because that's just the Bengals' philosophy, and people are going to hate that. I don't hate it because I think it's worked for them in years past. I would say more so than the whole. I think where Scott's coming from with they have one guy and the whole like Johnson was there and then Dunlap was his replacement. That was kind of what people were saying when Jones and Sanu left. They were saying that the Bengals were going to offer Sanu, but I wouldn't say that I wouldn't make the assumption that Hill's like already like dead man, who's out of Cincy pretty much just because they extended Gio. I think that it's more so their philosophy of they really like guys on the outside. That's why they always draft corners high. That's why and they don't really take a lot of defensive ends high, but they took Hunt and Clark in the early rounds. They took Dunlap, I think, in the second. And then you have guys like Gino, Domatot in the fourth round, Billings in the fourth round. And granted, he was a steal, but I think that there's a reason why they didn't draft him higher. It's just a matter of that's the way they build their team. And with other teams, you see like the Panthers, for example, under who's their it's now the Bills head coach, Sean McDermott. The Panthers were kind of different in the sense that the Panthers were like they worked from the front back. So they they built their front seven with guys like Charles Johnson, Coney Ely, Kewan Short, Star Lotulele, and then they had Luke Kuechly and Thomas Davis in their nickel packages. So they had all that front seven. And people were thinking, oh, well, they franchised Josh Norman. That was kind of a weird thing for them to do because generally they were just able to plug and play, aging veterans like Kurt Coleman or just like a young rookie fifth rounder, whatever. Put those guys at corner and safety, and the front seven is so good that it will compensate for the lack of playmaking talent on the back end. The Bengals, I mean, Scott kind of touched on it. And I think Andy Benoit was kind of the one who really alerted me to that philosophy, is that it's just that's the way the Bengals built their team, is they build it from the outside corners, receivers, tackles, in. So then all the later guys, all the inside players aren't as important to the Bengals, which is interesting because they run a lot of interior runs, especially with Jeremy Hill. So I don't know. It's weird. It's a weird thing to me. I don't think it's right or wrong. It's just the way that they've built their team, and who knows, maybe they change that and they extend Zeitler. So yeah, the Zeitler pick, like Scott said, was a really strange thing in retrospect to see that they picked a guard in the first round. I think it's because they had two picks in the first round is why they probably picked him, because it was just a luxury and you take that when you have it. But I don't know. I wouldn't say that Bowling being signed long term has an impact on whether or not they sign Zeitler. I just think if they think that Zeitler's going to go for the money, and I mean, they're obviously going to offer him whatever they want to offer him, but I just don't think that they value the guard position that highly. And I personally, even though I like Zeitler as a player, and I think he's a really good player, he's a solid fit for the team, and it would suck to lose him, I don't think it's the end of the world, because I don't think guard is a very important position for the Bengals, at least. They don't do a lot of pull, like I said earlier, they don't do a lot of pull blocks, which for some teams works really well. Like the Steelers with David DeCastro and their tight ends, it's been like it's Le'Veon Bell gets a lot of credit for his patience as a runner, but he wouldn't have you be able to afford that patience if it wasn't for guys like DeCastro, and then their tight ends, Jesse James, Heath Miller, have all they've traditionally had really good run blocking tight ends and you have DeCastro and a tight end pulling or just those combo blocks on the outside. It really made it easy for the Steelers, like schematically, for Bell to be able to afford that patience. And the Bengals, meanwhile, don't really do a lot of. They don't do. I mean, they do some zone blocking, but it's not to the same extent as a lot of other teams. They seem to run the ball up the middle a lot more, which is kind of frustrating as a fan because it's a little less exciting to watch. But it is what it is. So I mean, yeah.
And that kind of plays into an argument for the Bengals too. When you talk about DeCastro and his effect on the Steelers, and you look at Marcus Pouncey, their center, who's been a Pro Bowl player. I mean, it kind of plays into the team re-signing Zeitler and the need that they have to do that, and Whitworth as well. I mean, I don't want. It's a fine line to walk because this team obviously has done the deal where they've let these longtime veterans who may or may not have earned their playing time play over these possibly exciting young players that they have on the bench. But I mean, I think at this point, what you're getting from Zeitler. You might get a little bit lesser product from Whitworth just because of the age, but he's still a very good starting left tackle at this point. Here's my thing. I agree with you, Connor. If Zeitler leaves, the Bengals aren't, it's not like dire straits and all of a sudden, they're going to stare at another losing season automatically just because they lose their starting guard. My thing, though, is when you look at last offseason and how the lack of continuity and the losing of certain players that had a great chemistry, mostly on offense, affected this team, whether it was the coaching staff, the wide receivers, all these players and coaches left. And it really, I think you saw it affect the product on the field. And I don't think the team, and I guess this is kind of the double-edged sword that comes with, quote unquote, drafting well and developing certain players well. I don't think they can experience another offseason of losing important players. It seems like the coaching staff's going to stay intact, so that's at least good from a continuity perspective. But I just think that the team, with their good players, they need to keep them. And if for some reason they can't, then they need to go out there in free agency and they need to make moves to better their team. Because if they lose guys and sit on their hands once again in free agency, that's not going to sit well with the fans, and there's not going to be any tangible evidence of improvement on their team from a 6-9-1 season last year. So to me, especially when you've heard it from so many people, continuity on the offensive line, and the fact when a group plays together for so many years, they know their strengths and weaknesses, they know their tendencies and the game plan. I think it's important that the team keeps that intact, and I think that's why Zeitler is maybe more important than other. If he were to be a free agent in another offseason, it's just that continuity perspective for me.
I agree. I think it just feels like a waste of resources at the end of the day. You drafted a guy so high, and it's the same thing with Dre. You drafted a guy high. Zeitler, he definitely, learned he got good like earlier in his career than Dre. But both these guys, you took them high. They've become the guy you wanted them to be. You just can't lose them in free agency, especially this year, like you said, AC. It's just. You look at the free agent market, and who is there if you lose Zeitler? There's like TJ Lang, who's older. I think he's in his 30s.
Well, he'll be just as expensive.
And yeah, he's just as expensive. And then behind him, there's such a significant drop off. Dre, I think, is going to be easier because you look at the corner market, and there's a lot of guys. He's like, I think we touched on it last episode. And plus, you have guys like Sam Shields, Tramon Williams, who just got cut. It's a replaceable position, and so. I don't know. I don't think that there's going to be a huge bidding war on corners this year. It's also they don't have like the Josh Normans like last year. They have the best guy in the market is AJ Bouye, who if Pro Football Focus didn't exist, literally no one would know who that guy is. He had one pick last year. So, I mean, I think Zeitler, yeah, like you said, it's so frustrating Just to see like these reports that the team is maybe not going to sign. It's just like, why? Like you have the money, and I don't know. I mean, I just hope that he gets re-signed.
Yep. And they have the resources, and that's one of the things, unfortunately, that frustrates a lot of people with the Bengals. Scott, did you have something to add?
I just want to say, I think if we were to make predictions right now, I think I'd put my odds at like 5% he's resigned. And one example, a guy who comes to mind is using a high pick on a guard that they let go was Eric Steinbeck.
Yep.
They did the exact same thing with him. I think it was 2003. I think he was the first pick in the second round the year they took Palmer.
Yep.
Played guard, 4 years or whatever, played through the rookie year, and as soon as he was done, he was gone. And I'm sure they made some effort to sign him. At the time, it didn't seem like there was a very strong effort. And I think it's just, they, as we've kind of hit on, they just don't seem to put a big emphasis on guard or center. I know they were very desperate the year they got him. He was a top guard. He'd kind of fallen to them at the beginning of the second round. They had a huge hole at that spot. They grabbed him. He kind of filled that for a few years, and then his time was done. They're like, okay, we're not paying the money. Off he gets, which is kind of weird because you look at their strategy, and I know you hit on this too, that they insist on running the ball. They don't necessarily play to the strengths of their team. They played, a certain philosophy that here's what we want to do, regardless of what we have. And they seem to run a lot of plays where they really need good guards and good center play. And if you have, an injured Bowling, you have who knows who they're going to have at right guard. And Bodine at center, you're going to have Jeremy Hill running into defensive tackles again. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see what unfolds.
Yeah, and just for reference on that that Eric Steinbach stuff that you were talking about, number one, I think a lot of people kind of raise their eyebrows and saying, well, why aren't you re-signing this guy? He's a valuable player. At the time, the team actually spent a ton of money on offensive players. They had given Palmer a huge extension. They gave extensions to Levi Jones and Willie Anderson. They signed Bobby Williams. And then I don't know this for sure, but they may have given Rich Bram at some point a smaller contract extension. So they actually invested a lot of resources. Unfortunately, it was just Steinbach was the guy that they said, well, we just can't afford this guy based on, the two good tackles we have and other players on the line. So unfortunately, that was one of the better lines, when you had Levi Jones in his prime, you had Steinbach, you had Rich Bram, you had Bobby Williams, you had Willie Anderson. That was one of the best lines the Bengals have ever employed, and one of the better ones in recent memory. But you're right. It's part of a history, and we've seen history repeat itself a little bit with the team. They seem to devalue the positions of guard, tight end, even though they have used a couple of first-round picks on some recently. That's been a position they have not used high resources on in recent years for the most part. And then safety is even one until last season that they didn't really value all that high, especially in terms of high draft picks and things of that nature. So anyways, that's the positional analysis of the 2016 and 2017 Bengals offensive line. What do you think, listeners? You can get in touch with us in a variety of different ways. This was a great segment. We talked about a lot of different things, and we appreciate some of the feedback in the YouTube chat, as well as all of you that are tuning in live. You can check us out live on Cincy Jungle every Wednesday night, as well as on YouTube, and join the YouTube chat there. You can get in touch with us on Twitter at BengalsOBI, or via email, the obinsider@gmail.com. And you can download all of our content if you can't join us live on iTunes, SoundCloud, as well as our YouTube channels. Leave some feedback, leave a rating. We love to hear back from you, and we love to interact with a lot of the people who are involved in this show, because it is about you guys, the people that are tuning in and checking out our content.